In 1974, Shoichi Yokoi, a Japanese soldier, was found living alone in the jungles of Guam. He was one of the few soldiers who survived during the Second World War and managed to stay hidden inside enemy territory. It took 28 years later for him to be discovered without any outsider knowing his true identity. Born on March 31, 1915, Yokoi was an apprentice tailor before he was drafted to the military. In 1943, he was dispatched to Guam, a small island in the Western Pacific. This island was captured by the Japanese in December 1941 from the Americans. This was known as the First Battle of Guam. The Second Battle of Guam took place on July 10, 1944, when the Americans and indigenous people, Chamorros, fought together to retake the island. The battle ended with a victory for the Allies on August 10th. Most of the Japanese soldiers didn't survive, while those who were alive went to hiding in the jungle in fear of being captured. Following months after the liberation of the island, a Navy lieutenant, John Wigg, formed a combat patrol to hunt down Japanese stragglers in hiding. They were heavily armed and questioned islanders for any information. Luckily, despite a huge hunt down, Yokoi survived through this. On the evening of January 24, 1974, two men who were out in the jungle to check on their bait traps saw Yokoi standing by the river holding a shrimp net. At first, they thought that he was one of the residents living on the nearby village who were also out hunting. However, as they approached him, Yokoi turned around, then aggressively charged at them. He tried to grab one of their rifles, but was outmuscled and was subdued. Yokoi was 57 years old at the time and was quite weak. Standing at 5 feet and 6 inches in height, he was skinny and was quite pale, which was a surprise since he lived in a jungle of a tropical island that typically sunny and high temperature most time of the year. As they brought him out of the jungle, Yokoi begged them to kill him right there and then, just to get it over with. He expected that he would be tortured and be forced to give up intel. Instead, the two men stopped by at their place and fed him before bringing him to the police station. James Shintaku, the Japanese consul in Guam, was the only person who could communicate with Yokoi. From here, Yokoi told him everything, his identity, and how he survived in the jungle alone. He stated that his unit was annihilated during the Battle of Guam, and only a few of his men managed to escape. 10 others survived, and they were all in hiding together. The group slowly reduced in number as they were hunted down throughout the island by the combat patrols. The Americans alongside the Chamorros were on a lookout for any escapees. Yokoi was with 2 other soldiers, and the rest went their own way. They constantly moved around the jungle looking for a suitable place to stay. They couldn't stick to one area in fear of being seen in the open. The 3 learned how to fish together and crafted shoes made out of plant fibers. While the 3 lasted for quite a long time, the 2 members eventually left Yokoi behind after a dispute regarding on how the food should store. At the end, they went their separate ways, which left Yokoi all alone. Although the group disbanded, they still remained in contact with one another. From time to time, they visited one another to check up on what they're doing. Unfortunately, by 1964, he didn't hear from them again, and soon heard the news that they died from a flood. With nobody else around, Yokoi came up with the idea of an underground cave for the best solution on keeping himself undetected. The underground cave shaped much like a letter L. This allowed enough space for him to lie down and sleep properly, and since it used bamboo as a support material, it was quite sturdy. For his food, he fished along the Talofafo River. He ate shrimps, fish, and frogs. He also picked fruits such as bananas, papayas, and other tropical fruits. In spite of being in the jungle with no clock nor calendar, he was aware what date it was. He knew this by keeping track of the moon phases. Since he had experience in tailoring, it helped him in this situation. He used bark fiber and sewed them together to create clothing to keep himself warm. Also, since underground cave got very cold, especially at night, he built a small bonfire inside the cave. He also used this to cook his food. Of course, setting up fire in a tight closed area is quite dangerous and could cause smoke inhalation. He prevented this by creating a long narrow hole just above the first fireplace, which acted much like an exhaust. When it's rainy season, he built an entrance cover that is made out of bamboo to prevent excess amounts of water from entering. This also became a camouflage, so if any villagers pass by his underground cave, they won't notice anything suspicious. The majority of the time, he stayed inside the cave. During the day, he rarely gets out because he didn't want to risk somebody seeing him, and so most of the activities he did were done at night. Inside his cave, he had the essentials he needed: a homemade utensil, water containers, and homemade animal traps. Just in case for any intruders, he had weapons inside: 2 grenades and a rusty rifle. By 1952, Yokoi was aware that the war ended 7 years too late. Even though he knew about it, he still refused to come out because he felt ashamed returning back home. At the time, it was thought that the soldier is better to die rather than get captured by the enemy. He thought that exposing himself to others would only lead to his death, so he avoided all human interaction for the sake of his safety. At the end, after telling his story, he gave James Shintaku a list of relatives and requested to be sent back home so he can reunite with his family. In February 1972, he returned to Japan after 30 years. He received a hero's welcome. Hundreds of cameras were waiting for his arrival. He rose in popularity and often got invited to various interviews to tell his story. He appeared in TV shows and sometimes spoke in various universities on how he overcame living alone in the middle of the jungle. 2 years after returning home, a documentary film was made based on his story called Yokoi and his 28 years of secret life on Guam. His story sparked the possibility of other Japanese soldiers who may also be hiding after the war. One was Taro Nakamura. In 1974, his hut was discovered by a pilot flying over the island of Morotai in Indonesia. The other one, which was more well-known, was Hiro Onada. He too also hid in the jungle in the Philippines. However, unlike Yokoi, Onada refused to believe that the war ended and wanted to continue fighting. Most of comrades was aware that the war ended in 1945, but he insisted on keep going. In fact, he had killed people and engaged in various shootouts with the police. Total opposite of Yokoi's approach, Onada drew a lot of attention and somehow got away with it. He only flew home in 1974, after a higher-up personally traveled to meet him in person to take him back to Japan. Today, Yokoi's cave where he used to live is no longer there. It collapsed and got destroyed. A replica was made there for tourists to visit and see. Some of his handcrafted tools, clothing, and other items are now on display on the Guam Museum. Even though he returned to Japan, he continued to visit Guam periodically during the remainder of his life. He died of a heart attack in 1997 at the age of 82. He was buried in Nagoya with the same ceremonial headstone that had been used back in 1955 when he was declared legally dead.